Hi, I'm Greg Gagne, and this is Behind the Scenes with Greg and George Shire.
Greg, I am so excited to be part of this, the Gagne Wrestling Association, and what we're going to be hoping to do, fans, for you joining in for the first time and looking at our website, Greg and I are going to attempt to bridge that gap between how wrestling evolved from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and into the 90s and today. We know it's evolved, and that's some of the things we're going to be talking about here tonight.
And everybody out there knows it evolved too. And some of the problems that I have with wrestling today is where it has evolved to. And we're going to lay down the foundation and the footwork that all these great athletes laid before us to bring wrestling where it is today. And anybody out there is a historian or collector, we've got things for you that nobody else has, and you can get it right here with the GWA.
And you know, when Greg talks about how wrestling evolved, we all know that there's one man that really set the standard for what wrestling was during the 1950s. Verne Gagne, Greg's dad. And he had his first match in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and then he traveled all around the country for many years. During that 50s decade, Verne was one of the great wrestlers that had an amateur background, brought something to wrestling that really wasn't all that solid in those years. And that amateur background mixed with the professional element really made wrestling take off. And Greg, I know you and I have talked about how on the old Dumont network in Chicago, back in the early days of television, that was the only thing that was out there. And fans would tune into their little black and white TVs. And not everyone had a TV in those days. And they'd go to their neighbor's house or get together with the family, and they'd conjure around that TV set and watch wrestling. And Verne Gagne, along with just a very few others, Gorgeous George, one of the trendsetters that we'll discuss later, and Killer Kowalski, and some of those names that were big, Lou Thesz on the Dumont network, and Verne was one of the really early ones.
You know, when you talk about those wrestlers of the past, and they talk about the current wrestlers, well, when you talk about Hulk Hogan, well, before Hulk Hogan, there was Verne Gagne. And Verne was, you know, he was a superstar on that network TV. He was the first one to be on a network television show with Jack Paar, with the Howdy Doody show, if you remember that one.
Yes,
he was on that. He was on with Art Linkletter and Jack LaLanne, the great trainer of all time. So he became a household name in the 50s, as did many of these other athletes that we're going to talk about today. And when you talk about Killer Kowalski, 6'7", 270 pounds, there was nobody, and that was all natural.
Yeah.
So before The Undertaker, there was Killer Kowalski. And that's what we're going to do. Everywhere I go, people ask me, we used to sit down and watch wrestling in Minneapolis or in Denver or in Chicago or Milwaukee or Winnipeg, Canada. And our kids, we'd sit with our grandparents and our parents, and every Saturday night or Sunday morning, there we were watching All-Star Wrestling in the AWA. And they've asked what we want to do. We tell our kids about that today. They don't know what really got wrestling where it is. That's what we're attempting to do here, and we're going to do it for you fans out there.
One of the things too, Greg, when you talk about all these cities, is what a lot of the younger generation don't realize is that right now there are basically one major promotion, the WWE and the TNA. But what about during the 50s and the 60s when there were 30 to 35 individual different territories around the United States alone? And the wrestlers like Verne Gagne and those that we've mentioned, they were on the road 365 days a year, a lot of times by car, traveling 200, 300, 600 miles to get to the next town. And that was before airplanes became a big thing.
Well, I remember my dad, he used to get in and drive down to Chicago, wrestle and drive back, and the next night he might drive to Winnipeg, Canada and back. So really it was my mother that really brought us up. He wasn't home too much, but